This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of Same Old Fire by Movac, composed by Burning Aurora and Flowerhawk. Sirius gently banged his forehead against the cold glass of Remus's bedroom window for the umpteenth time. He didn't have a watch, but he'd guess he had been out here for 30 minutes. Maybe an hour, God, it felt like ages. He briefly considered the possibility that he'd lost all sense of time and had been standing out here for years, his skin prickling with the cold, and his boots squishily attempting not to smother Remus's mother's newly budding daffodils in the mud. He thought, perhaps, it would have been wise to wear a watch, because the decades he was spending in this garden were beginning to feel unbearable. That's not even to mention the hours, 9 of them, that it took to get from the center of London to Glasgow on a motorcycle that seemed determined to undermine him at every step, and left him having to pull a detour halfway through the journey in search of a replacement tire in who knows where England, as well as some replacement patience, which was unfortunately harder to get a hold of. He banged his forehead against the window again. It was a delicate balance. He needed to strike just the correct pitch and tone of knock to wake up Remus 2 days post-full moon while simultaneously not waking up his parents or anyone else in the neighborhood, ideally. Frankly, there was also the minor issue of whether Remus was in his bedroom to begin with, something that, if at this point turned out not to be the case, would lead Sirius to committing unspeakable crimes. He was fairly certain he was in there. Where else would he be? It made the most sense. This time he let his head roll back on his shoulders, groaned in frustration at the sky, and knocked at a medium volume with his knuckles.
Moon, ouch, fuck.
He yanked his hand back as the window slid open and raked his knuckles against the lip. He put his sore knuckle into his mouth but grinned around it at the sight of the familiar lanky torso hovering in the darkness inside of the room. In the moonlight, he could just make out the Patti Smith logo on his t-shirt, and more obviously, the exhausted demeanor of his posture.
Mooney, fucking finally, do you know how long I've been out here? I was about to give up.
Maybe in another half hour.
Sirius.
Remus's voice sounded rough with sleep, surprised.
How did you know I was...
Would you let me in? I'm freezing my ass off.
Sirius said, and turned around to pick a helmet and 2 brightly wrapped presents from the grass behind him. He shoved them through the open window into Remus's arms.
Yeah, all right. Don't fuck up my mum's flowers, please, dickhead.
Remus dropped Sirius's things on the floor and helped yank his scrambling form through the window and onto the rug inside. It was much darker in here, and Sirius could just barely see the outlines of furniture and the vague shape of Remus in the small amount of moonlight sneaking in through the dark curtains. Remus slid the window most of the way closed and leaned back against the sill. Sirius could feel his eyes digging into him even though he couldn't see it. He giggled nervously, then ran a hand through his hair, as though that would erase the fact that he just giggled from his memory. His fingers got caught in the wind-blown knots in his curls.
Pretty sure there's a bug in my sock.
Sirius muttered, brushing his hand over his forehead and finding a few crumbs of dirt there from the time he spent knocking it against a dirty window. He rubbed it away.
I was.
Hush, keep it down. My parents are asleep.
Sorry.
Sirius laughed gently, lowering his voice, and let his vision wander around the room, because he was finding it hard to look at Remus's outline against the window without seeing his face. A silence so awkward fell over them that Sirius wanted to scream. That would probably make things worse.
Shoes.
Right, sorry.
He dropped to the floor and began attempting to loosen the laces on his high-top leather boots. He hoped that they weren't so muddy that they were leaving the rug dirty, but considering how much he had been sliding around outside the window, he doubted he'd be that lucky. He'd clean it up in the morning, when he could see.
Shit.
He muttered quietly under his breath after his second failed attempt to squeeze his foot out of the boot without fully untying it, and resigned himself instead to fully yanking the laces out of their holes, because sitting here, trying to get his shoes off under Remus's, he could only assume irritated gaze, was starting to make him sweat. He heard Remus huff a little sigh in the darkness, and then watched the shape of him wander past him back to the bed. He ruffled Sirius's hair on his way past.
It's good to see you,
Remus said as he passed.
You too.
Sirius said, just as he managed to get his first boot off. He dropped it on the ground and winced at the sound, then, more quietly, said,
Sorry.
Sorry, I'm so tired from the moon. I've barely slept in days.
Remus said, accompanied by the sound of him flopping back into his double bed.
Yeah, course. I didn't know you were here before, or I would have.
I wasn't. Just got here yesterday.
Oh, where did you?
Inverness.
Oh,
Sirius said again, stupidly. He always used to know where Remus was. In fact, he always used to know where all of his friends were. This new trend of only knowing some things sometimes was making him lose his mind a little. He stewed on this thought as he yanked the laces out of his second boot with a little extra vigor. Why the hell Inverness? What the hell was in fucking Inverness of all places? And why didn't he know about it? It was farther north than any of them had ever had to travel for the war before. He felt the recently all too familiar buzz of frustration building up in his head and took a deep breath to calm himself as he yanked off the second boot and put it more gently next to its brother. He stood up and listened to Remus rustling in the sheets and felt suddenly a bit like a kid waiting to be told what to do, standing there in the center of the rug swinging his arms. That irritated him even further, so he stripped off his riding jacket and let it fall near his boots, then wandered uncertainly to the opposite side of the bed and sank down onto the floor beside it. His eyes were starting to adjust to the darkness, and he could just make out a squiggly pattern in Remus's duvet.
I didn't want to miss your birthday.
He said at length when Remus didn't put him out of his misery by starting any sort of conversation. He was pretty sure he'd missed it. He could hear the ticking of a clock somewhere in the room. It was too dark to pick it out of the rest of its surroundings, but there was a stillness that you only ever got when it was after midnight. Remus didn't say anything.
Meant to be here ages ago, but Moody pulled me into something in the morning that I had to deal with, and then the bike wouldn't fucking start, and I hit a pothole on the road and popped a tire, so, yeah, sorry I missed it, Moon.
Well,
Remus said, still sounding endlessly sleepy, but Sirius could tell that he was smiling by his voice. His drawn-out well reminded Sirius of what he sounded like when he was about to suggest they do something they weren't allowed to do back in school, and it tugged at some nostalgic string deep in his gut.
if we'd gone out for my birthday, we'd probably still be out drinking or doing something stupid, so I don't think you missed anything.
Sirius huffed a laugh and rested his forehead against the mattress, watched his own painted fingers picking at the pile of the rug gently in the dark.
Yeah, well, missed a couple moons, didn't I?
That's not your fault.
Maybe.
Sirius let himself peek up through his knitted brow and watched the lump of Remus wrapped up in his blankets. He thought, but it was dark enough, and Remus was sleepy enough that he probably wouldn't be. He waited for Remus to say something, but he stayed quiet. The most frustrating thing about Remus, to Sirius, was that when you wanted him to say one thing, he'd say something else, and when you wanted him to say anything, he kept his fucking gob shut. The last time Sirius had seen Remus, Sirius had willed him to say all sorts of things, but all he'd said was,
I have a job.
and Sirius said,
Okay, be safe.
he had wanted to say much more himself, but what could he say? Sorry. He wasn't sorry. And if it wasn't sorry, what was it? And what would that conversation have even led to? And, in any case, there was no time to get into anything anyway, because Remus had a job to get to, and when was there ever time anymore? So he just let Remus walk out the door and spent the rest of the day tinkering uselessly with the motorcycle and high out of his mind, muttering under his breath to himself about how annoyed he was about the entire situation like a crazy person.
I can't sleep when you're moping so loudly.
I don't mope.
Sirius scoffed, continuing, very stubbornly, to mope.
Fuck moons. I've been on the road since 3 to come see you. You aren't even.
Sirius groaned, frustrated at his own inability to get a coherent thought out of his mouth.
Don't you at least want to open your presents?
Oh, Pads, please.
Remus's voice floated from the pillows, and he sounded so pathetic and pleading that Sirius immediately lost all fight.
I haven't shut my eyes in more than 2 days. Tomorrow.
Sirius finally grunted in agreement and dropped his eyes back to the rug. It was very soft and fluffy, and the action of picking at it was the only thing keeping him from spilling his guts out all over the floor, in more ways than one. Remus pulled back the corner of the blanket closest to Sirius, and Sirius watched Remus's disembodied arm pat the mattress from where it poked out from the heap of blankets, dark against the white sheets in the dim light.
Lay down, will you? You're making me nervous.
Sirius pulled himself off the floor and began to climb in, thought better of it, stripped his jeans off down to his boxers, kicked off his socks, then laid down. He pulled the blanket up to his ears and peeked across the hills of blankets and pillows at the curly cloud of Remus's hair poking out of the bedding. The bed smelled so overwhelmingly like Remus that for a second Sirius got emotional. It smelled like him, and like dust, like it hadn't been used in ages. Sirius hoped that he didn't smell too badly of the road after traveling by bike all day long, and had the brief ridiculous thought that he should have broken into another building somewhere and showered before he knocked on Remus's window.
I haven't heard from you in months,
He said finally, and hated himself for how hurt he sounded even to his own ears. Remus was quiet for a long time. His voice was quiet when he said,
I know.
I was worried.
Sorry, I'm okay.
Sometimes talking to Remus made Sirius feel like he was being tossed around in waves. 1 second everything would make sense. It would feel so natural and familiar and calming to talk to him. Then suddenly, before Sirius could even understand why it happened, one of them would say something that hit too close to the heart of things, and Sirius would have a frog in his throat and his heart would be pounding, and it would be hard to see how he was so comfortable only a second ago. A week before Remus left on war business, James and Lily had thrown a party for Marlene's birthday. The mood was hardly joyous enough for real parties these days, but James could always pull together a group of 15 or so people who were willing to pretend things were normal enough for the night that they almost wound up enjoying themselves. The war always draped anything enjoyable under a veil of gray, but they made a valiant effort on the odd weekend. Sirius remembered things feeling good, then. He remembered finding himself and Remus alone on the green velvet couch in James and Lily's living room, the only ones too couch-locked and too in their own world to care about seeing whatever it was James had wanted to show everyone in the backyard. He remembered laughing until tears ran down his face about a joke that Frank had told earlier, that Remus had just repeated. He remembered giggling together when Sirius asked if Remus had noticed how Marlene and Dorcas were eyeing each other across the room all night, and Remus had said,
What? No, really?
and Sirius had nodded, his eyes wide and eyebrows wiggling, and Remus had said,
Well, I hope they figure things out.
and he sounded so fond and wistful that it made Sirius warm. He had drunk the last drop of his beer, then, and let his own bottle clink down on the floor by their feet, and stretched across Remus and stole his still half-full beer, baring his teeth at Remus in a grin knowing he wouldn't stop him. He liked to poke at Remus and find the line, always pushing just a little further. Then he settled leaning heavily against Remus, because he took any opportunity to touch his friends, especially when he was feeling a little tipsy. He attributed it to having shit parents who never hugged him as a kid. But whatever it was disproportionately directed toward Remus at almost all times. He tended to try not to think about it very hard. In fact, he tended to actively force himself not to think about it, because those thoughts did not feel particularly safe.
I didn't know how to reach you.
Sirius said when he realized he'd been silent for too long.
You should have said something, when you knew you'd be gone so long.
The pillows and blankets that made up Remus sighed. His voice sounded unsure.
I didn't. I wanted to.
And
The top of Remus's head shifted, and he was quiet for a long moment.
Got in my head about it.
He said finally,
could have told Jam.
You would have been upset I spoke to him, and not you.
Yes, but I would have known you weren't dead.
Sirius snapped, then kicked himself for snapping. Being a dick wouldn't help anything. Remus didn't say anything, and then continued not to say anything, and Sirius wanted to kick him out from under his pile of blankets and shove him until he said something, but instead he said,
Look, I know it was weird before you left, and...
Please, can we not right now?
Remus interrupted, for the first time sounding genuinely annoyed.
When then?
Hush.
You avoided me for a week in our own apartment, then fucked off for months.
Sirius sat up then, yanking the blankets down because he couldn't stand to have this conversation without seeing Remus's face, even if it was too dark in there to get a good look.
You couldn't even send word.
It was then that Sirius, his eyes now adjusted sufficiently to the dim light, noticed the new jagged scar cutting an angry line down Remus's face. It started above his brow, crossed to his cheekbone, and slashed down across his lips, ending at his chin.
Fuck, Moon.
Sirius breathed. Remus sighed and ran a hand down his face as if that would scrub the mark away, not making eye contact.
It's fine, really.
It's not fine.
Sirius laid back down and tentatively reached out. Remus didn't move away, so he gently ran his thumb down the scar from Remus's brow down his cheek. It felt too intimate to touch his lips, so he pulled his hand away before he got close enough.
I should have been there.
You couldn't.
You never get hurt when I'm there, not once. I should have.
You couldn't. I wasn't alone.
Well, wasn't that something? Sirius didn't know what to say to that. He couldn't quite put a finger on a justification for feeling jealous and angry upon learning this fact, but he couldn't let go of the feelings nonetheless. He caught Remus's eyes, and the look in them made him wonder what Remus had seen in his face just then. Remus didn't seem to know what to say either. Sirius sighed and rolled onto his back, pinched the bridge of his nose between his thumb and pointer finger. He wasn't sure if he had a right to feel hurt, but fuck if he didn't feel it. He could hear Remus turning onto his side to face him. Remus was quiet for a moment, then said,
It was orders.
Jesus.
You know I had to.
That's where they've been sending you. Wolves.
Where else would they send me?
Remus said, and Sirius could hear the bitterness in his voice.
You could get hurt. You did get hurt.
Remus sighed.
Tell me about it.
Sirius demanded. He knew Remus would say no, but he was ready to fight. He wanted to fight. Since when was he so angry all the time? He didn't remember being this angry even only a few years ago. He could hardly recognize himself sometimes these days, but he tried not to think about it because there were too many other things he was mourning already.
Tomorrow.
Remus's voice caught him off guard. It had no fight to it at all. He just sounded exhausted and sad and maybe even sorry, and suddenly all Sirius wanted to do was give him a hug. He turned to face Remus again.
Was this all?
He asked, quieter, and gestured to his own face, mirroring the spot where the scar was healing on Remus's cheek. Remus was quiet for a moment, and Sirius could tell that he was considering not telling him. He already knew that wasn't the worst of it. He could practically read him like a book sometimes. Other times it was like speaking at a brick wall.
Few more.
Remus said.
This one's the worst.
He shifted the blankets down a little further and lifted his shirt to reveal a bite mark etched into his side. Remus healed extremely quickly, but not so quickly that the bite didn't still look a bit raw and painful, even with the filter of the darkness of the room over it. Some dark bruises peeked out from below the shirt as well. Sirius reached out without thinking and touched his fingers gently against the bite, but pulled his hand back quickly when Remus flinched.
Sorry, it hurts.
Not really.
Remus said.
Just sensitive, cold fingers.
Sirius chewed at the inside of his lip, watching Remus pull his shirt back down over his stomach.
If I was there...
What did you get me?
What?
My presents, what did you get me?
Sirius shook his head, the question not making sense for a moment, in light of these more important, more dangerous things.
Well...
I can't just tell you.
Sirius said.
You have to open them. That's not how presents work.
Oh, go on. You had 2 gifts. Spoil one for me.
Sirius took a deep breath and exhaled it through his mouth. He watched a breeze from the still, slightly open window unsettle Remus's hair, and could feel the goosebumps on his own skin in the chill.
Fine.
Sirius rolled his eyes.
Remember when I accidentally shattered your Bowie album when we smoked around New Year's?
You got me a new Ziggy.
Remus sounded so genuinely excited that Sirius couldn't help but smile at his reaction.
Yes, sir.
Oh, pads.
Remus said, grinning. He pulled the blankets back up over the both of them and wriggled down into them against the cold.
Thank you.
Of course, it's literally nothing. Should have gotten it sooner.
You didn't have to.
Wanted to.
Remus's grin widened.
What about the other one?
Shut up, can't weasel them both out of me.
Hush, you're so loud, fuck.
Sirius sucked his teeth and rolled his eyes.
Look, if you wake them up now, they're going to want to say hi. Then they'll be making you tea, and then we'll be dragged into the kitchen. And then they'll want to feed you because you came so far. And by the time the whole welcome parade wraps up, it will be 4 a.m., and I'll still be awake.
You're still awake now?
Remus sucked his teeth. Sirius laughed.
Fine,
he said, and scooted a little bit closer and dropped his voice.
I'll whisper.
Okay, good.
Good.
They fell into a comfortable silence, and Sirius let himself watch Remus for a moment as his eyes drifted shut. He thought his eyelashes looked so soft where they fell next to the harsh scar on his cheek. He hoped the past 2 months weren't too difficult, but he worried based on the bags under Remus's eyes that they had not been the easiest. He tried to remember what exactly they were talking about, back on the couch at Marlene's birthday party, the last time things felt easy, but he could only remember vaguely. Maybe something about a concert. He hadn't been to one in over a year at the time.
I feel like I'm losing all the art in my life,
He'd said, and that broke his heart a little bit. There was the sound of muffled laughter from their friends in the backyard, the feeling of the velvet couch against his arm, the weight of Remus's arm around him, his hand resting on his hip.
I need to find more time to play music.
He'd said, and Remus's thumb hooked just under the hem of his jeans at his hip bone. And suddenly, that was all Sirius could think about. The ghost feeling of where his nail had softly scratched against his skin where he slipped his thumb into the waistband. He had turned to look at Remus, and Remus was smiling and looked at him quizzically like he was expecting a question. But when he saw the look on Sirius's face, his smile dropped slowly, and Sirius caught his eyes flicking down to look at his lips, and he saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed.
Moon?
Sirius had said. His voice was deep, and it cracked a little, and he could feel Remus's breath on his face, and he was certain Remus was about to say something. But then the door to the backyard slid open, and they could hear the voices and footsteps of their friends coming back inside, laughing and speaking loudly, and Remus's voice was rough when he said,
I have to.
and he stood up and walked away. Sirius was left there on the couch holding Remus's half-drunk beer, staring after him, and James walked up and yelled,
Shoes pads, what the fuck?
and Sirius dropped his boot off the couch to the ground, and James smacked him upside the head. Having fun in general was tenuous at best these days. Sometimes it felt like clinging to having a good time was as difficult to do as keep water in the cups of your hands. Any little bump in the road had it spilling away, and all that was left in its place was war and anxiety, and whatever the fuck that was. He thought Remus must have fallen asleep when he spoke again.
How'd you know I was here?
Remus's eyes were closed as he spoke, and his voice a whisper so close to sleep. Sirius wasn't 100% certain he wasn't sleep-talking.
Guessed.
Guessed.
Remus laughed sleepily.
How?
I got out of Moody that your job was done finally, and that it was up north, and I thought that if you weren't home yet for your birthday by now, you'd probably be home.
I might not have been here. What if you missed me on my way down?
But I didn't, did I?
No, you found me.
So then, no reason to worry about it.
You're balmy.
Sirius laughed. Remus was quiet for a time. Then when he spoke, there was a smile in his voice.
I'm happy you're here.
Me too.
Sirius said.
Missed you.
Me too. Was just thinking about you.
Were you now?
It was quiet just long enough for Sirius to wonder if Remus had fallen asleep for real this time.
How's everyone?
Sirius scoffed.
Worried, busy and worried and nervous.
So same as always.
That question hit like nails on a chalkboard. Just as Sirius always used to know where all of his friends were and how they were doing, so did Remus. Sirius didn't like having to answer this question for him. He shouldn't have to answer this question for him, because Remus should have been home and he should have seen the answer for himself. Remus shuffled under the blanket.
We're okay, right?
Yeah, think so.
Sirius meant it. He thought he meant it. Truthfully, he'd been getting more and more nervous about whether or not they were okay. When they were laughing and chatting, everything did feel normal and like they could ignore this thing that was stretching between them like a taut rope. But then something like the party incident would happen, and Sirius would try to lean into it, and Remus would lean away. And in those moments, he wasn't sure if they could ever be okay. In those moments, he'd think they were fucked, actually. So many small things, even at that party alone, where Sirius would think they were on the same page. Like Remus standing too close to him against the kitchen counter, their shoulders touching, even though there was plenty of room, heads low and joking with each other, or Remus's fingers lingering against his just a second too long when he handed him a drink, or Remus's damned thumb hooked into the hem of his jeans. Then, every time it fell apart. That night, Sirius had followed him from the couch to the backyard. When he got there, Remus already had a joint lit between his lips. He was laying perpendicularly in the hammock, his long legs hanging off the edge, heels dug into the earth, and swinging himself gently back and forth, blowing smoke into the stars. Sirius had walked over to him, knocked his boot against Remus's chucks lightly, until Remus scooted slightly to the right and made room for him. He laid back next to him, let his feet drag against the soil as Remus swayed them slowly back and forth, let their shoulders press together at the bottom of the arc of the hammock, watched the sky through the smoke and the bare branches of the trees above. Remus had reached over, put the joint to Sirius's lips, and Sirius breathed it in, kissed his fingertips. He'd followed the path of Remus's hand with his eyes, and watched his profile as he put the joint back to his own lips, inhaled, then left it hanging out of the corner of his mouth. Lightheaded and buzzed, he'd thought, fuck it all, and sat up, balanced himself on one elbow, took the joint from Remus's lips. Sirius had leaned over him, the long black waves of his hair falling around them like a curtain, and he remembered the look on Remus's face, his eyes wide, his eyebrows soft, his lips parted like he was about to say something, and for a long moment hovering over Remus like that, his hand pressed against the side of Remus's neck and jaw, joint still in between his fingers. Sirius thought Remus was going to let him kiss him, but then he felt Remus's hand press against his chest and push him back. Remus had stood up from the hammock, paused there for a moment, and watched Sirius slide into the new center of gravity. He'd dropped his eyes to the dusty ground. He'd said,
Sorry.
And then he'd walked away, left Sirius sitting there with the roach burning in his fingers and feeling cold and stupid. Sirius barely saw him for the entire week after that, caught no more than glimpses of him heading out the door or creeping home late at night and locking himself up in his room. He could hardly stand it. Then Remus left and was gone for months. Being here, so close to him, made it so easy to let himself pretend that he could just be okay. Still, more and more, it was getting harder to live in the okay moments, because he knew what was always around the corner. He knew he'd catch Remus looking at him in a way that he wouldn't be able to play off as friendly, or he'd let their knees press against each other, sat around James's fire pit, or he'd make him a cup of tea without asking, and Sirius would let himself get his hopes up again. Then Remus would step back again, always another step back, as soon as Sirius reached for it.
You know, maybe not now that I think about it.
Whispering it like this felt so intimate and such an incorrect way to communicate this feeling. Being quiet and in a shared cocoon of blankets and pillows, having just pressed his fingers into Remus's skin and felt his scars. Remus didn't say anything, but Sirius could just barely see him watching him through the darkness, his brow furrowed in the way it always got when his feelings were hurt. Sirius ran his hands through his own hair, turned onto his back again because he couldn't stand to look.
Maybe I'm frustrated, actually.
Sirius.
Remus's voice was cautious.
No, you know I am frustrated.
Sirius sat up, yanked his damned hair out of his eyes again and spat the strands of it out of his mouth. It was always getting into his mouth. He should have chopped it all off years ago.
How many times are we going to go around in circles?
You're being too loud.
Remus sat up too. He sounded annoyed, but if Sirius didn't know better, he'd say he looked scared as well. Sirius didn't even try to contain the scoff, the laugh that was just this side of too mean. He rubbed the heels of his palms into his eyes and saw stars on the insides of his eyelids, whose images lingered in his blurry vision when he opened his eyes again.
God, aren't you fucking tired of it, Remus?
What do you mean?
Remus asked, in a way that sounded like he knew exactly what Sirius meant. Sirius folded his legs in front of himself, turned his body to face Remus head on. Remus remained facing forward, but watched Sirius from the corners of his eyes, like he could avoid the conversation if he didn't look at it directly.
Every time I think we're on the same page, you turn around and make me feel like a fucking idiot.
Sirius said. Remus said nothing.
I'm not stupid, Remus.
I don't think you're stupid.
Could have fooled me.
Wait, just...
Remus groaned, put his hands up in front of himself in a stop motion. He sounded a little panicked when he said,
You're going too fast.
Am I? Because I feel like I've been going at a snail's pace for years, actually.
Sirius.
Why have you been avoiding me?
I haven't been avoiding you. I've been lying low, working. I haven't even been around the war.
You avoided me for a full week before that.
God, why are you so irritating sometimes?
Sirius huffed a frustrated breath, lowered his voice again because regardless of how annoyed he was, he really didn't want to wake Remus's parents down the hall and have to talk to them right now. He knew he sounded frantic now, but he couldn't bring himself to care.
Aren't we too old for this shit, Moon? Years, it's been years.
Sirius always spoke with his hands when he got worked up. His feelings were too big to express in words alone, and he was afraid this one was going to have him literally tearing his hair out.
I could handle it when we were 16 and idiots, because I could barely even admit to myself what I was feeling, but fuck, Moon. I can't do this anymore. I'm done pretending there's nothing here.
He gesticulated between the two of them, shoved Remus's shoulder.
I didn't come all this way just to sit here avoiding what happened. I can't. I can't spend every night out catching you staring at me and touching me, and then blowing me off or worse, watching you go home with someone else. So, that's it.
Remus stuttered, muttered,
Shit.
under his breath.
Sirius, I really shouldn't.
What, be happy? Get off it. If you say the word werewolf right now, I think I'll break your nose.
Remus scrubbed his hands over his face and let himself fall back into the pillows again, hid his face in his arms.
Jesus, this is...
So fucking just...
Sirius winced. He didn't like sounding overly emotional or stuttering. He was getting as annoyed at himself as he was at Remus.
Either stop fucking looking at me like that or let me do something about it.
He watched Remus lay there, his face hidden, barely moving, and he wanted to strangle him. He was pretty certain most people would forgive him once they heard the full story. After a long beat, and just before Sirius resorted to homicide, Remus said,
Do something about it.
muffled by his arms.
What?
I said do something about it.
Remus sat up again, angled himself to face Sirius. It took a moment for Sirius's brain to catch up. If you'd asked him to bet on it, he probably would have guessed that Remus would say, "Sorry, I'll stop," and then he'd have to spend the next few years adjusting to that change in their dynamic. When he resolved to start this fight, he thought maybe he'd need to move in with Jaime and Lily after this, to avoid awkwardly skirting around each other at their shared apartment. He thought that he'd end up miserable and having to mourn the little touches and stares that he, in reality, loved a lot. Because he loved attention, yes, but he especially loved Remus's attention, even if it did leave him feeling like the most pathetic and brainless mutt in existence most times. He grabbed Remus's t-shirt collar and yanked him in for a kiss. He came in far too quickly, and their teeth clacked together. Remus yelped and recoiled, holding his face where his lips slammed into Sirius's teeth.
Fuck, you know I'm injured, right?
Shut up.
Sirius said, and took Remus's face in his hands, pulled him in with a marginally more gentle urgency. He kissed him right on the spot where the new scar cut through his lips. He put his all into it. He'd kissed plenty of people in the past, but right now he felt like he was still in a fight, and he kissed like he meant to win it. It felt brand new. Remus's eyelashes fluttered soft against his cheek, and that made him feel like digging his way into Remus's body and building a house in his chest. Remus was all stubble and sharp edges, pushing and pulling at Sirius like a tide, giving it as good as he got it. Sirius shifted onto his knees, nothing on his mind beyond getting closer. He crowded into Remus's space, slipped his hand under his t-shirt, trailed it up his body. Remus winced and made a small pained sound.
Fuck.
Sirius hissed. He'd forgotten the wound in Remus's side, the bruises under his shirt. He hesitated, began to pull away, but Remus chased him with his lips before he could get out of reach. He took Sirius's wrist and pressed his hand back against his skin, leaned into it, leaned over Sirius and kissed him down into the pillows until their legs were tangled, and Sirius's heartbeat was rushing in his ears louder than he ever remembered hearing it. The weight of Remus above him was overwhelming and reassuring at once, and Remus's hands winding in his hair felt grounding. Sirius didn't know where to rest his own hands. He wanted to feel all of Remus, his shoulder blades, the dip of his spine, his ribs, the gentle rise of the scars under his fingertips. He wanted to soak it all in and remember every part of him, in case this was all that he got. That thought sent a bolt of panic through him, but then Remus's thigh ground up against him at just the right angle and distracted him. Sirius moaned. Remus pulled away just enough to press his hand urgently over his mouth. He dropped his forehead against Sirius's, and they breathed heavily into each other's space.
If you're not quiet, I'm going to stop,
Remus said, sounding just as breathless as Sirius felt. Sirius nodded minutely against his hand, eyes wide, until they drifted shut at the million sparks that ran through his scalp and down his back when Remus closed his other hand around a fistful of his hair.
Good.
Remus whispered, and let the hand covering Sirius's mouth slip away, replaced it with his soft lips and tongue, rolled his hips into him. Sirius made a small sound, willed himself to be quiet. He busied himself pulling Remus's shirt off his back to distract himself, because he'd be damned if he fucked this up for himself, and he'd be double damned if he wasn't going to take this as far as it would go now that he had it. Remus pulled back to yank the shirt over his head, and Sirius followed him, kissing any part of him that was close enough to reach. But then Remus put his hand on his dick, and he instantly forgot himself and groaned far too loudly.
Shit, wait.
He whined, sitting up and grabbing at Remus's arm as he pulled away. He made the conscious decision to not be self-conscious about his whining.
I told you.
I know, please, wait, I'm sorry, I'm quiet.
Sirius put a hand over his own mouth, speaking with decreasing volume, and punctuated it with a muffled,
See?
He hoped the look on his face was more endearing and sexy than pathetic and begging. Remus watched him for a moment, and, briefly, Sirius thought he'd fucked it all up. But then he caught sight of that pinched little smile Remus put on when Sirius did something particularly amusing, but he was trying not to be amused by it, and the frustration and mild panic melted into a nervous heat at the realization that Remus was trailing his eyes down his body, taking him all in. Then Remus leaned back into him and pushed him back down onto the bed. Sirius tried to put his arms around his neck, but Remus took one of his hands and guided it back to covering his mouth.
Quiet.
Remus whispered in his ear, sending prickles down his spine. Sirius had gone through some difficult moments in his life. He spent a lot of time in school, forcing himself to study under threat of various punishments, in spite of very strongly preferring to be fucking around with his friends. At the time, that was very hard. Then there was a real rough patch when he was 17 and freshly disowned. Another time, early in the war, he distinctly recalled getting so frustrated that his pet project, meticulously planned 3-week-long reconnaissance mission, resulted in absolutely no viable information that he briefly considered becoming the resident paper pusher in order to avoid the agony of another failure. But at this moment, as Remus's teeth grazed his neck and he kissed his way down his chest, pausing briefly to bite gently at his nipple through his t-shirt, Sirius knew that staying quiet tonight was going to be one of his greatest challenges. Maybe he was being melodramatic, but when had that ever stopped him from hyperbolizing? Remus tugged at the waistband of his boxer briefs and patted him a couple of times on the side of his hip until he lifted them off the bed to give Remus the space to push his underwear down around his thighs. Sirius watched Remus as he kissed slowly down his stomach. He let his free hand, the one that wasn't resting over his own lips, ghost over Remus's tight curls, scratched gentle lines down the back of his neck and across his shoulders, tattooed and lined with scars. He felt a pang in his chest at how delicate this all felt, even in the moment. He kept thinking, any second this could end, and they'd be back to the way things were, but now with this heavier, more complicated thing between them. Then Remus licked along the length of him, and he stifled a moan in the palm of his hand. He caught Remus's eyes looking up at him, dark and barely distinguishable in the dim midnight room, and he tried to meet his gaze, to be steady and confident and sexy, but it burned too strongly, and he let his head fall back again against the pillows, and bit the pad of his palm between his teeth to keep himself quiet, swallowing hard. Sirius thought about how in all the hours it took him to get here, he never expected this. In all the fantasies he had over the months that Remus was gone, and longer, if he was being honest, the furthest things ever progressed was a kiss. Not because Sirius was a prude by any means, but because at the time he was certain that the most logical and likely conclusion would be for Remus to tell him to fuck off, or that he'd say, "You're imagining things," or brush him off with an, "Okay," and the flirting would end. And he thought that Remus would probably not appreciate him fantasizing about fucking him into the mattress under those circumstances, even if he couldn't read his mind and would never find out. Remus sucked his cock into his mouth and Sirius nearly sobbed. He wanted it all. Now that he was here, he wanted everything that he could get, and he wanted it now. As sublime as it felt to have Remus bobbing up and down in his lap, he knew that he wouldn't be able to last, so he pushed himself up onto his elbow, cupped Remus's jaw in his hand, and gently guided him up until Remus noticed he was asking him to stop. Remus met his eyes, a questioning quirk in his brow. Sirius reveled in the open, vulnerable look on Remus's face, spent a moment getting lost in his eyes, gently dragged his thumb over the stubble at Remus's jawline.
Fuck me.
Remus groaned, dragged himself up the bed, and kissed him deep and dirty, all tongue and teeth. He grabbed Sirius's arse, heaved his hips up more firmly into his own, and ground down into him.
Now fuck me now.
Sirius sounded desperate, grabbing handfuls of any part of Remus he could reach. Remus tore himself away from their tangled form and pulled a bottle of lube from the side table drawer.
This bottle is probably 7 years old.
Remus said apologetically, examining it as well as he could in the darkness.
Fuck's sake. I don't give a shit.
Sirius hissed, pulling Remus in closer again. Remus laughed and kissed him as he repositioned himself between Sirius's legs. He blindly fumbled with his pajama bottoms and pushed them down just far enough, lubed up his fingers and prick, and hooked one of Sirius's legs over his arm. He met Sirius's lips again, more gently this time, and pressed his finger gently against him.
Hush.
Remus instructed him quietly, and Sirius nodded, his arms wrapped around Remus's neck, the only thing keeping him grounded.
Fuck.
He breathed against Remus's lips when he pushed in. He felt like he could cry. He thought he actually might cry, and that was so embarrassing, and he was pretty sure that if that happened, he'd need to flee the premises. The pining was bad enough, but to add crying into the equation at this point would be pathetic. As soon as he started to get used to the sensation of one finger, there was a second and he groaned, but Remus caught it in a kiss.
Hush, you can be good, right?
Remus whispered, and Sirius nodded again frantically, although his brain was hardly operating above 50% capacity, so he was fairly certain that any promises he made in this condition would not hold up in court.
Fuck me. Fuck me.
If Remus wasn't inside of him immediately, he would simply perish, and then Remus would need to deal with a dead body, and wasn't that worse than simply giving him what he wanted? Remus shifted down the bed, heaved Sirius down to meet him by his hips, and propped his leg higher up on his arm. It was really doing something inexplicable to Sirius that Remus was able to drag him around so easily. Then, Remus's tongue was in his mouth, and he was pressing into him slowly, and thought became impossible. All anxiety and overthinking and every what-if swirling around his mind fell away. All that was left was the sweet, slow pressure and gentle burn of Remus bottoming out inside him, their rasping breaths in the quiet room, the caught little moans in the backs of their throats, threatening to escape. Sirius grabbed 2 solid handfuls of Remus's arse and rolled his hips, eliciting a stuttered gasp and increasingly more feverish movements until the squeaking of the ancient wooden bed frame forced them to ease things to an excruciatingly slow and near unbearably gentle crawl, which left Sirius feeling absolutely wrecked, his heart aching with the tenderness of every careful kiss Remus placed upon his skin. Afterwards, once Remus had cleaned them both up with a discarded t-shirt and collapsed on top of him, head resting on his chest, buried in pillows, sheets, and a down blanket, all Sirius could think was that this was it for him. The stresses of their lives, walking into danger in hopes of creating a future worth living, even if they might not see it themselves, the loneliness and the fear. If Remus was there on the other end of it, he could go through most anything.
I'm sorry.
Remus rasped quietly into his chest.
I'm not.
No, I mean, at the party. And before that too, for being scared.
I'm scared too.
Sirius admitted, his voice small. So many things could go wrong. He wasn't even sure he could trust Remus to keep this same energy once the sun came up, and that scared him most of all.
Well,
Remus said, his voice drifting into a sleepy drawl.
we can be scared together.
Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic composed by Burning Aurora and Flowerhawk.